Welcome back to the second half of this morning's webinar. Our first guest now is Roger Leventhal of Marin County Public Works. Thank you so much for being here, Roger, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you for allowing me to present today. As Virginia said, I represent Marin County Flood Control and also CHARGE, which is, as John Bourgeois mentioned the first day, is this organization. Essentially, it's all the flood agencies and public works departments that ring the bay. And that's appropriate because really it's your generally underfunded, understaffed flood agencies that are going to be the ones who implement and have to deal with a lot of these nature-based and traditional solutions around the Bay Edge. We're really the ones responsible for dealing with flooding in a very urbanized estuary. And I think we need to come back to that. There's a lot of people who live around the Bay, and we deal both with the people that go to these kinds of webinars, but also the other side of the coin is a lot of people who aren't so enlightened and have a lot of concerns over property and impact. So today I get to talk about an interesting topic, which is the use of beaches as an alternative to riprap and walls for eroding shorelines. So I work for Marin County. And Marin is, I think, probably the most existentially threatened by sea level rise of all 9 Bay Area counties. If you can see my cursor, this is the existing shoreline out here with the at the edge of the light blue and the dark blue. And this map shows, I think, like 50 inches of sea level rise, but actually at a much lower level of sea level rise. That very low eastern edge of Marin County is flooded, and along with most of our major cities, all up and down the eastern edge of Marin. So, it's either us or San Mateo, and often we're debating for the dubious distinction. But I would say, existentially threatened, Marin probably comes out just because all the infrastructure, all the people, the roads, et cetera, is all along that sort of low eastern edge. We also have a deal with the fluvial flooding. It's a very flash flood watershed kind of topology. And so and as many people know or may know, that one impact of sea level rise with the higher water levels is that it impedes gravity drainage. So your storm drains don't drain. So another impact is just not this direct coastal flooding, but the inability for your drainage system to drain, as well as higher groundwater, as well as a myriad of other things. And that's all. Marin is the poster child for even sunny day tidal flooding, king tide flooding, down at the Manzanita Park and Ride and off the 101 heading to Stinson Beach. You can get 3 or 4 feet of water just on a sunny day tide during king tides. But I want to talk about the other side of sea level rise, which is shoreline erosion, which is happening all around the bay. So it's not just flooding is a major impact, but also shoreline erosion. And this is just really typical of the shorelines. If you just walk around the bay anywhere, you'll see this combination of often unengineered or poorly engineered shorelines with just debris, up to what I'll show pictures of in a minute, this highly engineered riprap shoreline. This will get worse as the sea level rise gets deeper, because it gets deeper water is higher waves, and then also to the square or so of the depth is the wave energy, the wave power that does the work in eroding shorelines. If we use more ferries, there's ferry boat erosion. So we're seeing that all around the bay. I have a few other photos of just, really could be anywhere. The sort of unengineered rubbly shorelines. This one in Powell Street is a lot of times people dumped asphalt and other things along the bay. There's also a failing of shoreline. So this is out at Paradise Park in Marin. I'm going to come back to this site, but where somebody had tried to repurpose old blocks to protect the shoreline. Well, anyone who's dealt with water knows the power of water, and that it just goes through and overwhelms the blocks, and just you get a backside erosion in these in a lot of places where the more traditional or historic efforts to stop eroding are starting to fail. Another impact of shoreline erosion is this is the #1 source of loss of tidal marsh. It's not from flooding, but it's actually the scarping and scalloping of the bay edge. So this is the Mill Valley shoreline, but you can see this also a lot of places where you see marsh erosion, where you have this sort of slumping edge due to the water carving off the edge of the marsh, and then this is how you lose marsh habitat. I think I have another slide of this, and this is one where I annotated, again, in Mill Valley, where you can just see the waves come up here to the marsh edge, but a lot of this slump block faulting from the scarping of the bay edge. Loses tidal marsh habitat. Okay, so we have as other speakers have talked about, we have a future to talk about. What do we want it to look like? So this is a large part of the shoreline all around the bay. This is what would be the traditional, more engineered riprap shoreline. Why it does maybe work in the short term to hold the edge where you want it, it is a lot of impacts, especially to habitat, because there's really, I think, no habitat to this shoreline except for rats. And you can break your ankle walking down these slopes getting to the bay. So this is the more traditional, plus the cost of taking all this quarry stone and placing it. And then other places, people are starting to do more sheet pile walls and all sorts of engineered solutions around the bay. So do we want rocks and walls, or walls and rocks? And I usually put this slide in here for the English lit majors, just to sort of metaphorically look at this idea of San Quentin imprisoning there, and we're imprisoning the shoreline here. So my attempt at a little metaphysical slides, but essentially this is this sort of wall and rock here feature is what we're doing all around the bay. So let's look at options. So the SF, referring back to what I think Julie Beagle and Letitia talked about, the Adaptation Atlas. You know, we've been working on beaches well before the Atlas, but the Atlas was a nice tool for education, and also for taking a few criteria and gathering them up and giving planners and visionaries an idea of what sort of nature-based solutions might be applicable. The Atlas is very careful to say it's not a design document, but it does tell you what might be applicable in your location. And beaches were identified as a big part in certain areas as an adaptation alternative. And this is some work that we presented a while ago. We've now updated it in a recent report I'm going to show you at the very end. But beaches are a part of the historic bay landscape. And we put together a little sort of a little tiny atlas of locations of the different types. And in the bay, they've, sorry, this thing moves ahead. And they've gone from, we have some coarser grain beaches up at Point Pinole. That's the only cobble beach historically in San Francisco Bay, to sand pocket beaches. And what I've been promoting, and it's true, really, that Southern Marin is really one of the great laboratories to look at these kinds of alternatives because of the range of coastlines, from steep cliffs to more alluvial, sort of more gradually deposited shorelines. And we even have ocean swell that's only found in this part of San Francisco and the Southern Marin as another processes that goes to looking at beach design and development. So it's a great place to trial and pilot different approaches for this restoration alternative. So rather than spend a lot of time talking about engineering design, I was asked, and I think it's good to show a project that we built. I did this as a consultant, as a design engineer with Peter. Stuart Siegel, many of you know, was the prime, along with Dan Gillenwater. This is actually almost a decade old, before I came to Marin County. And in some ways it shows how, while in some areas we've made progress, in other areas we haven't, because this is probably the last one that I know of that was built in the Bay as a beach project. There's several others in design, including some of my own, but we, as many speakers have talked about, I think there's a lot of challenges to nature-based solutions. We've heard a lot of the positives, but we probably haven't spent as much time on the challenges, even the limitations, and we need to pick up the pace, I guess, in order to get these ideas out there. And as Letitia mentioned, part of the more traditional engineering approaches to solving these problems and these challenges. So Rambu Island is in outer Richardson Bay in Southern Marin. It's this sort of backwards looking horseshoe monkey wrench kind of island. It's artificial. It was built with dumping dredge mud on top of dumping alluvial hillside from Strawberry Hill, all those homes to the left, They dumped them on there. They were going to build a bunch of homes like exist on this next spit down here. Unfortunately, the homes never got built, but the island actually itself, since it was built in the 60s and so, has experienced about 130 feet. And you can see that characteristic shoreline scarping that I showed you, the shoreline. So it was a really good place for a pilot demonstration project. Also, because no one lives on it, it's a great place to try things out, less liability. What paid for it was, many of you may remember the 2007 Costco Busan oil spill. A bunch of oily birds washed up on Rambu Island. Bad for the birds, good for us. Richardson Bay got a $1 million settlement, I believe, and then some small part of that went towards designing, and we brought this idea to them about building a beach. It wasn't necessarily a known thing back then, to use some of that money to build a demonstration project. A lot of times I get people saying, well, the waves are too big or the wave climate doesn't work. Let me tell you, Rambu is one of the most difficult places to build because we get these southern storms in the bay. It's got a very long effects from the south. And it's also very, what you really want is the wave direction, perpendicular to the shoreline. The waves from Rambu Island are almost transverse. So it tends to push the sediment to the north, and we've seen some of that. So I would say it is wasn't an easy place to build a demonstration project. And so when people talk about, well, the waves are too big or the energy is too big, it's really not true. And there are beaches of this type. I mean, bay beaches are unique in their own way, but there are beaches all along the outer coast. You just need bigger rocks and sediment. At Rambu, it was tough in that sense. And again, just another view of as the island was eroding, we got this cobble lag, which is not mobile, and this sort of typical around the bay edge, 3 foot tall or so, scarped edge due to the wave energy. This is to the south looking there out to the Bay Bridge. Okay, so what we did is we divided the island into 3 cells, essentially. The highest wave energy to the south, we used the coarser stuff, used sort of a mixed design in the middle, and smaller material and more oyster shell to the north. Built a series, which I'll show you just one picture of these eucalyptus micro groins, a term we made up instead of the big core groins, to try to retain the sediment as best we could. There's certainly some lessons learned about sediment retention, things we would do a little differently. We would do more complexity, I think. That's a big part. It's sort of wood, more of this wood. Some of that didn't get built, some did, but where it was really instrumental in holding the shoreline system. So beaches are a system. Sandy foreshore, gravelly, coarser grained, high storm berm. We won't spend a lot of time on sediment. Sediment is a big challenge, though. There's some sand in the bay that gets mined commercially. The gravel tends to be pretty small, so for the bigger stuff, for the bigger waves, we'll need to import. But there is some material in the bay, but we are somewhat supply limited on these coarser grained sediment sizes. So these design features are really the subject of another talk for another day. So on the construction. So let's see how this looks. So this is us doing the initial grading out of the scarp. Again, this is all back in around 2011, 2012. It happened over 2 seasons. These are fun to show. This is the initial piling of the oyster hash. This is more in the middle and to the north of the project. The stuff is an interesting property because it's actually lighter than sediment and it's very reflective. So the shorebirds just saw this. It was like a beacon and they just like dropped out of the sky to use this habitat once the site was built. It's very reflective. This is laying out the oyster shell to the north. I'm gonna go through these quickly because I want to get to a few more slides. This is building one of the micro groins, essentially eucalyptus. Probably a lesson learned, some of them we should have extended maybe a little bit further out. And this is placing the sand for the foreshore. It was not easy to get this permit. BCDC as an agency exists, especially at that time, to avoid fill. So we got it kind of in a pilot exemption. But I think now what a big change in the consciousness of the agencies and the people is the need to put sediment strategically and to use it where we can and makes sense to rebuild these sorts of living shoreline solutions. Well, now I want to show a series of monitoring photos. So this one is right after post construction in December 2012. So that scarp is right down the middle, essentially where it was before we graded it out of the of this oyster pile. Got our first storm in, I think, February of, it wasn't too big, but it started to work. And what these are, it's kind of nice. These are sort of, we call them self-organized systems. Essentially, you can also place the material in the right place at the right size, and nature will work it and make it stronger. It's actually better when it's worked naturally rather than, and that is a big difference between this and riprap. Just to say that riprap is designed not to move. Beach systems are designed to move. Within, they need more space, but essentially that's a strength of a self-organized system. Another photo. Now this is a post one of the big storms. We had a series of big storms, and it really looks just beautiful. It's just textbook of what you want to see. This is after, it was like a series of March, very, very big storms and wave energy, and got the gravel berm to the inward that's moved up, and the sand. And I'll show you in the video, if I hopefully have time, the importance of the permeability of beaches in dampening wave energy. Again, works as a system. So I try to tell my coastal engineering friends, the ones that are more traditional, think of this as maybe tiny little riprap that's designed to move, essentially, as opposed to what the training is, which is a big angular, that stuff that comes out of the Dutra quarry, like I showed you, they want that as angular as possible so it locks. We want the sediments to be as round as possible. So in the sense that they can organize themselves to the prevailing wave energy. This is out after another series of storms in 2012, excuse me. And then this is a cross section, like you were to cut a loaf of bread. This is the elevation of the ground. It's highly exaggerated. A foot here is much there. But the point of this slide really is just, we didn't build the gravel berm up to the high wave energy. It adjusted itself. And that's the benefit of the system. It adjusts to the local energy, and you don't have to build it. And there's a winter profile and summer, so they're complicated, but it does the work in dissipating wave energy. The birds just fell out of the sky. I'm not a biologist, but these birds that have the orange bills are super cool to watch. They skim the surface, looking at the turns, tons of turns. Richards of Audubon was our client. The site is owned by Marin Parks, but they weren't that involved really in the design. It was Richards of Audubon. They did a lot of bird counts and tons more birds. All sorts of cool looking ones, kind of a close up on that orange billed one. They even got their own Facebook site, celebrating their return. And we in Flood Control even got a rare piece of shout out in the Marin IJ, which usually just bashes us. A positive story, a little cartoon there about Rambu Island as a positive. And I'll say that the neighbors initially were very against this project. They were worried it would attract endangered species, but now they've really come around to embrace this. And I think part of the education process, which I'm excited about this seminar, is they realize that, I mean, they got, this island is helping them by breaking the waves before they break on their property. So then that led to, I've always been interested. I want to keep doing this. Riprap is, as we've talked about, a detrimental. So we got, in 2018, I got a grant through the Marin Community Foundation and the Coastal Conservancy. I want to thank both of them. Marilyn, who's coming up next, is our grant manager, and she's been pioneering living shorelines, starting in the subtidal and all sorts. So she's been a really, really important person for us. So we just finished a report doing preliminary design at 3 more sites in Southern Marin. I'm going to quickly show you each of them. And one is Seminary, Greenwood Beach in Tiburon, and then Paradise Park in the Tiburon Peninsula. Greenwood is in the town of Tiburon. Okay, so starting with Paradise Park, this is an actively failing shoreline. As you can see from these photos, this is where these blocks were put in somewhere in the 60s or 70s to try to stop the erosion, and then they dump riprap behind them. That traditional sort of engineered approach. What I like about this view is it shows the eroded areas, but it also shows that there is a existing beach there. There was a beach historically. So it's possible. What happens when you put these hardened structures is the wave energy it becomes very erratic and destructive. And essentially, it's reflective. It's not doesn't infiltrate. It's not absorbed. It's reflected. That reflected energy erodes the beach, and that's what's happened here. It's just eroded all that beach and caused more shoreline erosion. I have great pictures of this, but it's an actively failing shoreline. So we did a preliminary design there. Seminary, the next one is kind of an interesting site. It's just off of Seminary Drive. You wouldn't even know it was there unless you were looked, but it's going to be a great example if we can build it of where they stopped the riprap and then the erosion continued. I mean, they didn't install the pipe sticking 8 feet out, it's eroded back. And then I don't have a photo of it, but if you continue down, there's a little bit of historic remnant beach that we've been able to tie into. So we've done a design here that will be, I hope, eventually a great demonstration of rock riprap versus coarse grain gravel beach as a treatment, as a living shoreline alternative. And then finally, our third site is out in Tiburon. The park here is called Blackie's Pasture, but the beach is called Greenwood Beach and Bernini Beach. Again, sort of remnant historic beach, but a lot of erosion of the shoreline. I'll show you a lot of this rubble lag, I believe I showed you at Rambu. So it's an interesting site, much more habitat value. There's some existing marsh here we want to protect, and there's some low tide terraces and such. So we've come up with the design for this. First, I'm just going to show you the shoreline there real quickly. Running out of time. This is what it looks. Again, that characteristic scarping edge. Out at Greenwood, they'd filled, I think this is part of this, over an old road or gravel layer. So the asphalt is eroding out. It extends out into there's large asphalt chunks. Not good for water quality, not good for the animals. But this very characteristic of just sort of dumped shoreline beach, where communities, even Tiburon, I guess, didn't afford or didn't want to spend the money to hire an engineer to put the big rock riprap. So maybe that's good. Gives us more opportunity to restore it. So our report ended up showing bookend options for restoration. And the first one is this idea of an engineered gravel beach. I like this idea because I'm an engineer, but there's some places, I think, like especially Paradise, where we want to, I think, look at building a gravel beach to break the waves offshore, to dissipate that wave energy away from the eroding shoreline. So this is how it looks in cartoon view. It still has habitat benefits and values, but it's designed, I think, more for the purpose of protecting infrastructure. So the other approach, actually, no, that's how this looks as a cartoon. This is how we look at it if we were doing an engineering talk, and all these parameters go into the design, the breaker height, the breaker depth, and plunge pool. So it's designed to break it and plunge it up here. Again, this is not a design talk, but just to let you know, there is some science and engineering in this in this design approach. All these design approaches, but the other one is a more a little more what we did at Rambu, Peter Bay's more approach, which is a feed called dynamic nourishment. The idea of give it the right material, the right size, and roughly the right locations, and let the system self-organize. Again, there's all pros and cons. This might require more nourishment over time, require some retention structures, but is a much more naturalistic, I think, more appropriate for this beach at Greenwood than, say, probably some other ones that are actively eroding. But our report, which has just got done after a long 2 years. No, I'm sorry, this is the plan view look at the dynamic nourishment approach. Again, this idea of placing sand and gravel in the backshore rather than building a large or a cobble beach offshore to break waves here. It sort of naturally nourishes a system. But a lot of our systems, and what this is saying is don't have enough material, because due to cutting off of the natural supply, a lot of it comes from hill slopes erosion, and we've cut off a lot of that material by blocking the erosion of hills and such that feed these systems. So we need to feed them to make them work, and that's this approach much more than the more engineered approach. And I call them bookends because I think they both have value. They're both discussed at great length in this report that just got done. It's about almost 200-300 pages. And it's a preliminary design, not final, but I think if you're interested in the weeds, so to speak, of beaches as systems, and I'll just close before I go to two small videos and say, we haven't built enough of these, so we need to not be afraid to pilot, to build things. There's really very little downside. So we can start testing, where's the limits of wave energy for a beach? Where is rock riprap needed? And one of my roles, I'm on the BCDC Design Review Board. I'm now emeritus after 20 years. But every project that comes through really almost defaults to riprap because that's the traditional solution. So we need to start showing other the viability and where these things work and don't work for other systems. So now I think I just have 2 short videos. I think I can do them according to Justin. So these are your 2 moments of Zen. So here, this is a wave hitting sorry, that didn't work. Went backwards. So I'm trying to go back. A beach without a shoreline, without a beach, a hardened shoreline, without a wall. You can really get a sense for that chaotic wave energy. It comes in, bounces back, does its work eroding. If you put a wall here, you would see even more so. But rock has the same impact as the waves sort of reflect. They aren't absorbed. So I can envision this working during big storm events to erode the shoreline. So with a beach. Now you can see the waves, how they dissipate. This is the same event, same climb. It just gives you a better sense of what we've been sort of talking about, theory about how it works to lower the wave energy and works towards protecting the shoreline.
Thank you, Roger. It's incredible what can be done and what is being done. So thank you so much for sharing your work with us. Our next speaker is Marilyn Lata from the California State Coastal Conservancy. Welcome, Marilyn.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being part of this session and everyone's work to put it together. So I'm really glad to now take us into the submerged habitats of the Bay. And I think it's a really nice transition to the talks that Roger and Letitia have given. So we'll talk a little bit about the value of Olympia oyster beds and eelgrass meadows and the ways that we're linking these habitats to beaches and tidal marshes so that we can learn, what tools in the toolbox can we use to build capacity to adapt. Here we go. I think you've already seen these pictures comparing our hardened gray traditional shoreline approaches, which can damage habitat and really cut off both people and, our critters in the bay from the shoreline edge. And so the value of nature-based infrastructure is really looking at these biological and physical benefits, thinking about how we can better connect our habitat types and how we can use them to build this green infrastructure. And this term, living shorelines, has been used quite a bit. It really just means utilizing nature to achieve both physical shoreline protection goals as well as create biological benefits for habitats and the species that we've been talking about. And it can play out in many different ways, as we've been hearing from the speakers. Certainly, we all love tidal marshes, myself included, but I'm really sort of happy to talk about some of the more underrepresented habitat types that maybe don't get as much attention. Olympia oysters are there on the top left. These are a species of shellfish that are native from Chile to Alaska. And we're lucky enough to have them in the Bay, both historically and currently. And so I'll talk about some reef projects that we're designing to enhance oyster habitat. And then there's many other species, including eelgrass, which is a submerged flowering plant in the Bay. Both of these species mostly exist below that low tide line, so we don't often get a chance to see them, which is why I wanted to include a lot of pictures for people to be able to actually see these habitat types. We have a lot of species of seaweeds, macroalgae, sand beaches, and that sand is both in the intertidal in the areas that Roger was showing and also lining the bottom of the bay in many locations, as well as rock and mudflats. And so we're thinking about how we can incorporate each of these into designs moving forward. And I really want to give a shout out, a lot of this Living Shorelines work has been occurring over the last decade or two on the East and Gulf Coast. And these projects have provided fantastic models for us on the West Coast. Many of them are a bit different. They have a different species of oyster. Their cordgrass is not our cordgrass. And so we really do need to look at particular location considerations and species considerations. A lot of these projects are built on private shorelines, so just individual homeowners that might have 10 feet or 100 feet of shoreline in front of their house. And so the projects are small. And with their lower tide range of 1 to 3 feet compared to the West Coast, which has a 5 to 8 foot tidal range, a lot of these projects are pretty accessible. They're tucked up high on the shoreline next to those houses and the shoreline edge. Whereas many of our projects, we're constructing features that sometimes are a couple hundred meters offshore. So there are differences, but there are still a lot of valuable resources that we can learn from, especially from areas like the state of Maryland, which was very progressive in 2008 in establishing their Living Shorelines Protection Act. They actually require that homeowners prove that a living shoreline wouldn't work before they're allowed to install a bulkhead or a seawall. And that can be done. There are waivers, but it's an excellent step to, encourage that thinking process and look at what are the options besides just defaulting to rock. And many states, North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, many others have developed pretty progressive programmatic permit mechanisms so that the local, state, and federal agencies are working together to create incentives. And the pictures on the bottom show that there's a lot of great public involvement that can occur. Some of this is challenging for us out here, again, with that larger tide exchange and cold waters and currents. We can't always be out in shorts, standing in the water doing these things, but there's still some opportunities to get involved. And there's just briefly too, to talk about the resources that exist for folks. There is a new, well, not new now, it's been several years, that the Army Corps developed a nationwide permit 54 for living shorelines. It needs to be modified a bit for our larger systems out here, but it's a great example of federal support. And in California, there are many actions that our Natural Resources Agency and others have taken. There's an executive order to prioritize natural infrastructure solutions, and a lot of efforts to create integrated programs so that we're looking at climate adaptation as well as habitat protection at the same time. I love this picture on the bottom. We had a biological illustrator develop this as part of the Subtidal Habitat Goals report. Sorry, the screen is so small, but on the left, that's our foundational document. It's modeled after the Baylands report that we've been talking about. It came out in 2010. And it focuses on a 50-year conservation plan for these submerged areas in the bay. And it's really been sort of the guide to our actions to link these demonstration projects and science to the management recommendations. And then there's also some excellent case study examples. The National Wildlife Federation put out this Natural Defenses in Action report, which I highly recommend taking a look at. 10 different case studies around the country, everything from the Mississippi River Delta to open coastal systems. And then other journals, which are highlighting the use of oyster reef and other types of restoration. So we've seen this picture a lot. Again, I just want to highlight, I think, Roger, we need to get the beaches into this picture. We don't have every habitat type represented. But I'll focus a bit on this lower edge with oysters and eelgrass and the work that we're doing to sort of integrate with the other tidal marsh work that's occurring in the bay. And also, this is very small, but I wanted to highlight that there's a great federal-state partnership, which is led by NOAA and the Army Corps of Engineers and many others, that has a lot of great resources to provide information to describe what we're talking about. Their SAGE program is an acronym to really highlight this green-gray spectrum that we're talking about. I don't know if you can see it, but on the far left are fully green examples where you might use only native plantings or vegetative material to achieve shoreline protection and habitat. On the far right is a fully gray example, like a seawall, riprap, levees, bulkheads, etc. But there are a lot of combinations in between, and most sites may not be perfectly suited to a fully green or a fully gray situation, and we may need to look at these combinations that Letitia and Robin and others were referring to. You know, a levee in combination with a lowered seawall, or placement of oyster reefs in front of a marsh that can work together in combination to achieve multiple benefits. And we've talked a lot about these co-benefits. I just want to highlight that many of these also apply to the submerged habitats. They're different species than the songbirds or tidal marsh species that we've been talking about. They can benefit things like salmon and steelhead, Pacific herring, Dungeness crab, a lot of the invertebrates and the critters that are really forming the base of the food chain in the bay that then benefit the birds and marine mammals and species that we're more familiar with. They can also attenuate wave energy, although at certain tides. So obviously, you know, we can't create structures that are 20 feet tall in the shallow subtidal, but we can have a good effect on wave energy at certain parts of that tide cycle. So in combination with other techniques and methods, this can really add up. We can help to accrete sediment, reduce erosion, even provide for outdoor recreation with kayaking and other types of fishing and other opportunities out there. Eelgrass beds have a lot of potential to sequester carbon, and there's a lot of work being done to look at that. We know worldwide, large beds that are persistent have the ability to sequester as much as redwood forests. So there's great potential there. We're still gathering enough data on our local eelgrass beds to really define how much they could sequester, but this is a very promising area of study. And you may have seen some recent news articles about Melissa Ward and Ariana Rickert's recent work from Bodega Marine Lab, which looked at the relationship between placing eelgrass plantings near to oyster reefs and the great role that eelgrass can play in buffering ocean acidification. They can absorb carbon dioxide and therefore reduce pH, or reduce acidification rather. And so that can help with strengthening the whole system if we put these things in combination. Sorry, I have a little lag with my slides. I did want to highlight, you know, what many of us have been saying, that one size does not fit all. We can't put an oyster reef everywhere. We can't put a beach everywhere. It's important to look at the historical context and also the particular conditions, the soil type and substrate. You know, is it cobble? Is it soft sand? Are there potential for vegetative habitats like eelgrass? What is the shoreline type and that slope? How exposed is it to wave energy? What is the adjacent infrastructure? Can we test something without too much risk with the built environment nearby, or is there high risk? And so therefore we need to go to more tried and true techniques before we learn more. And then it's also really critical to look at local support. We've talked a lot about the permitting, which is a necessary and important function to make sure that these projects don't cause more harm than benefit. But we're really happy to see, Dave mentioned the BRIT and various efforts that are occurring to help streamline and make more collaborative and efficient the permitting process between agencies. And community engagement is a huge piece of this as well. If we're, especially in the subtitle, if we're just constructing projects that nobody ever sees, they don't know they're there, they don't really know the benefits of them, that's not going to be as valuable as if we're engaging graduate students, engaging volunteers, making community presentations, engaging conservation corps and others, so that it really does have a community connection to the work. And there are a lot of site-specific considerations. I just wanted to show this map on the bottom right, which gives us just a brief snapshot of this public-private ownership in San Francisco Bay. A lot of people are surprised to learn that the Bay Bottom is not fully publicly owned. Agencies like the State Lands Commission and others certainly do have public ownership of many parcels, which we can see in those green areas. But the red areas are all private. And a lot of these were, mapped out and sold off as, with plans of future development and then weren't developed. but they're still privately held. And so these are opportunities to create public-private partnerships and work with both agencies and landowners to revisualize what we can do with those submerged lands. The bathymetry is important, depth is important. You know, it matters whether you have to walk out 10 feet or 1,000 feet or 1,000 meters, whether you need to bring a barge into 10 feet of water or 1 foot of water. These really have real world operational impacts on the type of projects that can be done. And I've talked a lot about just the shoreline orientation, especially to wind and wave energy, and how important it is to really respect and think about the habitats that are already there and that we don't impact them by trying to improve things. I don't know how well everyone can see it, but that map of the bay in the top sort of shows the depths. So the gray are areas that are less than 10 feet, which is much of San Francisco Bay, quite shallow. The middle gray is 10 to 30 feet, and then that darker black is greater than 30 feet. So it really is just those ancient river channels and our shipping, you know, dredged areas that are deeper, and we've got a lot of shallow area to work with. But it does require physical space as well. So that's why, you know, the amount of horizontal and vertical space are critical to look at. So we have our most recent project is our Giant Marsh Living Shorelines project at Point Pinole. Very excited about this work. And, you know, I have a great acknowledgement slide at the end, but certainly want to acknowledge that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, even though we're in the soft mud out here. There are many dozens of partners, from funders to regulators to the scientists on our team, consultants who are working together to develop these designs. So this project, we've got oyster reefs offshore. There are actually 3 different sets of reefs. Each one is combined with a different vegetative plant species. So we have oyster and eelgrass combinations. We have oyster reef and Pacific rockweed combinations, which is an intertidal seaweed. And then we have near to shore cordgrass and oyster combinations, so that we can really look at how well do oyster reefs placed directly adjacent to the shore edge help to protect and benefit Pacific cordgrass, which is a really important low marsh species. And I talked a bit about these partnerships. These are just some of the pictures of the folks on this team. You know, many hands make light work. I would certainly not say any of this work is easy, but many hands and many partners make the work happen and make the work more fun and valuable. I mentioned graduate students. Kathy Boyer from San Francisco State is our lead scientist. She and Chayla Zabin from the Smithsonian Institution, Ted Groschultz from UC Davis, Susan De La Cruz from USGS, many others are working together to have both consultants as well as graduate students and others participate in the projects. And we're putting a lot of effort into setting up experimental designs that are science-based. So the monitoring is the largest cost with these projects. We really are, for the first time, developing these efforts and wanting to show proof of concept. So we've got to have a clear understanding of what are the benefits, exactly which species are you know, showing improvements, are we seeing any impacts, and you know, how does that change seasonally? So the data is really helping us to refine the designs for each next project that we then construct. And I just have a few more pictures that I really want to walk through. I want to highlight the fact that these projects provide huge opportunities for green jobs and job training. I mentioned conservation corps. We've worked with the North Bay Conservation Corps and Civicor in Oakland, who both help to construct oyster reef elements, which we make out of a small percentage of concrete mixed with native sand that's mined from the bay and native oyster shell that Roger showed. You know, in his application, it was placed for beach restoration. In this application, it's actually mixed into what we call baycrete, which we then form into these different shapes and sizes so that we can test what works best for oyster reef construction. And then you can see some pictures down there of SF State students and graduate students, you know, preparing eelgrass, which we typically collect from donor sites. and then place out at the restoration site so that it can expand. There's also, a lot of opportunity for large-scale construction job opportunities. We've used clean Pacific oyster half shell from entities like Drakes Bay Oyster Company. That semi-truck, we had 6 semi-trucks full of oyster shell for our first project in San Rafael, about an acre of treatments. And that's been really valuable in testing the use of clean oyster half shell compared to this baycrete that we're using. So you can see just a couple of pictures of what it looks like, placing reefs at both high and low tide. You can see how shallow the water is with workers standing in the shallow water to help guide the placement. All of this takes really careful permitting so that we make sure not to impact, the resident species. And so I just put up the logos of our 6 main state and federal permitting agencies: Army Corps, NOAA Fisheries, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bay Conservation and Development Commission, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the state water boards. And we're really happy with the formation of the Regional Regulatory Integration Team, which is developing processes so that they can better coordinate together, they're co-housed together in non-pandemic times, and they can really address any conflicts between their mandates in a more efficient way. And so this is in process. And I'll just finish up. I've talked about the intensive monitoring, but these are some of the examples of what we're looking at, not only the oyster and eelgrass success, but invertebrates and bird use of the reef, fish use of the reefs, and also all of the physical attributes, how well they're breaking down waves, accreting sediment, water quality measurements, etc. And I think I have one last slide, and then acknowledgements. We've had over 100 species settle at our San Rafael site. At the more recent giant Marsh site, we have an estimate of over 400,000 oysters as of year 2, and that's a low estimate. We're seeing these reef structures reduce wave energy by about 30% at certain tides. And we're also informing additional pilot projects in California. So this just gives you a good sense of how it's spreading. And we're so happy that others are demonstrating these techniques. There are a lot of barriers to innovation. We've been talking about that. I think you've been talking about that during this webinar series. We do need a broader context to think regionally and really stand up to institutional inertia and be willing to discuss and pilot new ideas. And make sure it's feasible. We can't necessarily put wetlands off Manhattan, but we can think about what might be appropriate there. And I just want to thank, well, sorry, I had one more slide. This is a great image showing our science lead kayaking over reef structures. And so really designing for the future to think about what types of techniques we might incorporate. And I think we're now on the last slide of just thanking all the partners. So we really couldn't do it alone. It really requires a big mix of engineers, scientists, funders, and agencies to support this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marilyn. That's incredible work. So thank you for sharing it with us. I'm sure that spurred a lot of questions in people's minds. So feel free to use the Q&A box at any time for any of the speakers in this second section. We will be having our Q&A after our next speaker, who is Amy Hutzel from the California State Coastal Conservancy. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Thanks so much to the Sierra Club for organizing this series. It's been fabulous so far, and I've really enjoyed today and enjoyed the other speakers. I'm Amy Hutzel. I'm with the State Coastal Conservancy. We're a small state agency. We do work on the California coast and in the San Francisco Bay Area to protect and restore natural resources and to increase public access. And then we also help administer the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority that Supervisor Pine talked about earlier. So today I'm going to be talking about funding for wetlands restoration in San Francisco Bay. This is the show me the money part of the day. And what has been said frequently is these restoration, the restoration of San Francisco Bay, it really requires three things to move these great projects forward. It requires sediment, and you've heard a lot about that today. It requires the permits, and Supervisor Pine talked about the BRIT, so we're working on that front. And it also requires funding. And there's actually a lot of very positive movement on the funding side for our wetlands restoration projects. So I'm going to be talking about some example projects, then talking about some of the major funding sources, and then I've got some unsolicited advice at the end for restoration practitioners who are trying to move projects forward. Yay. So I'm going to start with Hamilton Wetlands, a project in Novato in Marin County. It's 1 square mile of restoration on top of a former military runway. So kind of an amazing project, and a partnership between the State Coastal Conservancy and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And this project took decades to come to fruition. But the site was breached in 2014 to the bay. So for the first time in over 100 years, waters from the bay entered the site, and it's evolving very nicely to vegetated wetlands. For this project, we used dredge sediment from the Port of Oakland and from other ports and navigation channels in San Francisco Bay in order to raise the elevation prior to breaching. And that was really the primary cost of the project, was getting that sediment to the site. And it was based on the model at Sonoma Baylands, which was the first project of that kind in San Francisco Bay. Vice President Al Gore came to the grand opening of Sonoma Baylands. So that gives you a sense of when that project occurred. And it was really innovative at the time in terms of bringing dredged sediment to the site. And there were lots of questions about how it would work. But at both Sonoma Baylands and Hamilton Wetlands, it's gone very well, but there is a price tag associated with that. So for this project, it was cost shared between the Corps, a federal agency, at 75%, and the State Coastal Conservancy at 25%. And then the Wildlife Conservation Board, a state agency, also put in funding for the project. And the price tag was 122 million approximately. Plus there were additional costs that were borne by the Port of Oakland and the Corps of Engineers to deliver dredge sediment from the port's minus 50-foot project. And then recently there have been several state grants to the Novato Bayland Stewards, which is a new organization that's supporting the stewardship work at Hamilton and at Belmarin Keys, which will be the next phase of the project. And they work with volunteers and Conservation Corps members and AmeriCorps members. And if you want to get engaged in restoration work, I highly, and you live anywhere near Novato Bayland Stewards is a really great organization. And there are other organizations like that around San Francisco Bay. And there are lots of opportunities to play a role in these projects. And then Sears Point, very close to Hamilton, and a really good contrast with Hamilton in terms of the restoration design and the funding strategy. This is about a 1,000-acre restoration project. And it was led by Sonoma Land Trust, who acquired the property from Grattan Rancheria. There was, for a very short time period, possibly going to be a casino at Sears Point. And Sonoma Land Trust worked with the tribe and with lots of other stakeholders to protect the land and then to restore it. And in terms of restoration design, instead of bringing in dredge sediment to raise the elevation, the design involved building up these mounds, and you can see all these little spots within the site. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving, but this is basically Sears Point in the middle of the photo. So building up these mounds and then relying on natural sedimentation. So breaching the site to the bay, and then as tidal waters come in, the mounds slow down the movement of the water and sediment falls out and builds up the site. So a much less expensive way of doing a restoration project, but still you've got to raise the money to do it. And in this case, Sonoma Land Trust raised money from, that's probably at least a dozen different state and federal agencies to support the project. So it's a lot of work to apply for all these grants, to manage all these grants, and then the grants all have, you know, deadlines and expiration dates. So it's a challenge, and Sonoma Land Trust was able to do it. In addition to the cost in the table, there was also the cost for the land acquisition, and the Moore Foundation put in funds for that. And then the State Coastal Conservancy helped with funding for the planning and design prior to restoration. But you can see that total cost, the $17.5 million for construction, significantly less than Hamilton. And now we're doing, and the Corps is involved in this, doing studies of Hamilton and Sears Point and kind of comparing the trajectory of the sites in terms of their evolution to vegetated tidal marsh. Another great example of a restoration project is the Dotson Family Marsh. It's a restoration project on the Contra Costa County shoreline. I believe it's an unincorporated Contra Costa County in just north of Richmond. It's possibly in the city of Richmond, but it is on the Contra Costa County shoreline near Parchester Village. And it was slated for development. Whitney Dotson, who's in the center of that photo, really led the effort to protect this land and to restore it. And East Bay Regional Park District deserves huge kudos for the work they did. They acquired this land. At the time it was called Bruner Marsh. They had to use eminent domain, which is not a fun process for a public agency and really prevents you from getting much in terms of state or federal grant money in order to secure the property. And East Bay Parks led up that effort and then led the planning and the restoration of Dotson Marsh. And again, they had to raise funds from, again, another dozen state and federal agencies to move the project forward. And East Bay Parks put in quite a bit of their own bond funding towards the restoration project. Plus they funded the land acquisition. And now moving to the South Bay salt ponds, a 15,000 acre, 50-year restoration effort involving many different partners and a very complicated funding strategy. The ponds were acquired from Cargill in 2004. Senator Feinstein really brokered this negotiation with Cargill. The lands are now owned by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, who owns Eden Landing, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who own the Ravenswood and Alviso ponds. So it's the lands circled in red. The project spans 3 counties. I think there's 9 or 10 cities along the project, and it involves restoration as well as flood risk management, and public access. And I couldn't even list all the different funders, so lumped them. And these are just the expenditures through 2018 for planning and construction of the project, as well as the original land acquisition. And we still have a ways to go. We've done phase 1 planning and construction. We have completed phase 2 planning and are moving into phase 2 construction, but there are many phases left to do, and it's being done in an adaptive way. So as we do phases, we monitor and then make decisions about the next steps in terms of restoration. And then earlier, I believe Supervisor Pine mentioned the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline project. That overlaps with the South Bay Salt Pond project. So it gets even more complicated in terms of the number of agencies involved in the work and the number of different funding sources. But you can see these projects are complicated to fund, complicated to move forward, and it takes a village in terms of the number of agencies and organizations involved in moving these forward. And now I'm just going to talk about some of the funding sources in a little more detail. And I'm sure I'm leaving out some important funding sources, so nobody be offended, please. And then next week, I think you'll be hearing even more about like US EPA, for example, and FEMA funding sources. So the US Fish and Wildlife Service, a federal agency, they've got a couple grant programs that have really heavily supported our wetlands restoration projects in San Francisco Bay. The National Coastal Wetlands Conservation Grants, known as NCWIC, and those are grants of up to $1 million per project, and coastal states are eligible. The State Coastal Conservancy, we've had great success with getting NCWIC grants for projects all along the coast and in the Bay Area. And it's funded by taxes from the sale of fishing equipment and boats and fuel for fisher people, recreational fishing. And then US Fish and Wildlife Service also has NACA grants. These are very focused on increasing bird populations in Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And projects are funded in all 3 countries by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And there's a commission, the Migratory Bird Conservation Commission, who approves the projects. And these are not just coastal, it's wetlands and bird populations throughout North America. And in the past 2 decades, they funded over 3,000 projects, nearly $2 billion in grants. And with NCWIC and NACA, especially NACA, these are not easy grants to apply for. And with NACA, you really have to show how you're increasing bird populations. The San Francisco Bay Joint Venture, who I'll talk about a little bit more, can really help with applications for NCWIC and NACA grants. And the Fish and Wildlife Service staff who administer these grants out of Sacramento are also extremely helpful. The US Environmental Protection Agency is also a major source of funding for wetlands restoration in the Bay through their San Francisco Bay Water Quality Improvement Fund. So this is a competitive grant program supporting projects to protect and restore the Bay. They can also do projects in creeks and watersheds that flow into the Bay. And since 2008, they've invested over $63.5 million in 54 different grant awards. And I believe you'll hear more from EPA next week. One thing they probably won't be able to advocate for is expansion of the program. So I'm going to do that now. Congresswoman Spear introduced HR 610, and there are other federal elected officials. I believe Huffman is a co-sponsor. Senator Feinstein is very interested in seeing this move forward to increase the funding for the San Francisco Bay program within US EPA. The amount of funding that the Bay has received through EPA, it's been great, but it is nowhere on par with Chesapeake Bay, Puget Sound, Great Lakes, other important estuaries and water bodies around the United States. And we'd like to see San Francisco Bay receiving similar amounts. So your support is encouraged, and you can express that support to Congresswoman Spear, to Senator Feinstein, to others involved. That's through the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Appropriations Subcommittee. And action is happening now on this program, so I encourage you to weigh in. And then the Corps of Engineers, one of my favorite federal agencies, spend a lot of time working with them. They have an aquatic ecosystem restoration program. It is not a grant program. Projects are planned and constructed in partnership with the Corps. So if you want to move a project forward with the Corps of Engineers, really you're committing to a long-term relationship with the Corps, a cost-sharing agreement, and the Corps is really leading up the planning and construction of the project. And there's two types of projects with the Corps. There are their large projects, their general investigations. These require congressional authorization and appropriations. And then the smaller continuing authorities programs. And by small, I mean like in the low millions of dollars. So there's several different types of these continuing authorities programs with the Corps. And then on the state side, the state primarily funds restoration of San Francisco Bay through state bond dollars. And most recently, that's been Propositions 1 and 68. And then the funding has come through a variety of state agencies. And over the past 20 or 30 years, state bond dollars have really been the largest source of funding for protection and restoration of San Francisco Bay. I believe it's been on the order of about $300 million total of state dollars invested in the San Francisco Bay. And I would just mention, wait a second. Yeah, so it's been a combination of competitive grant programs and then directed support for projects. Bond funding does have to be used for capital improvement projects. The legislature has been considering a climate adaptation bond, perhaps for 2022. And then in really positive news, the governor's May revise included $200 million for coastal wetlands. So the legislature is taking up the governor's proposed budget now, and we'll see where things end come July 1st, but there could be a very nice amount of funding for coastal wetlands restoration through the state budget. And then Dave, Supervisor Pine already talked quite a bit about the Restoration Authority and Measure AA, but this has been a real game changer for wetlands restoration in San Francisco Bay. So a 9-county measure, and just, you know, it was so gratifying to see the voter support for San Francisco Bay with that measure. So $500 million over 20 years. What's really great about Measure AA is it's a consistent, dedicated, flexible funding source for restoration. And it is funding for habitat restoration projects and then the associated flood risk management and public access. There are geographic distribution requirements. The projects are authorized by the board. There's an advisory committee. There's also a citizens oversight committee. And so far there have been 4 grant rounds, competitive grant rounds, and that first community grants program that Supervisor Pine mentioned. And then I just wanted to put a plug in for the San Francisco Bay joint venture. It's a partnership that has existed for several decades now in San Francisco Bay, federal, state, regional, nonprofit business members who work to protect, restore, and enhance wetland habitats in San Francisco Bay. And they can be extremely helpful with moving projects forward. So if you want to get involved in restoration projects, they're a great resource. Sandra Scoggins is the director. And I believe they have a total of 3 staff, so small but mighty. And then ecoatlas.org is the way that they do their project tracking. And that includes the funding. So funding spent and also funding needs. So if you're interested in projects, you can also look up what's happening in your community through ecoatlas.org. And then just some recommendations for funding of restoration projects. It takes partnerships. All of these projects took many different agencies and organizations. It requires a funding strategy. You need to figure out pretty early on in the project which path you're going down in terms of moving a project forward. It takes a sustained commitment. I mean, I mentioned with South Bay Salt Ponds, it's a 50-year project. These are not, drop in, move a project forward in a matter of years. These projects require decades of work. Really important to engage the community, elected officials, the regulators early and often. Make sure that there's broad support for the project, and make sure that you're communicating what is happening with a project. Having multiple benefits and goals really helps in terms of funding for projects. You can just tap into a much wider array of funding. So including public access, flood risk management, and more. I mean, Marilyn was talking about carbon sequestration. There's all sorts of benefits that these projects provide. Celebrating the milestones and successes, it's so important for the sanity of everyone involved in the project, and making sure to communicate to funders and to others what is happening with the project. And then I would just mention the funding for planning and monitoring and operations and maintenance. Those are the hardest pots of funding to find. So really important to be thinking about those early on, and how you're going to bring those elements into play. And with that, I will close. I would say out of this whole morning, my favorite line was from Roger, the birds falling from the sky. I love that engineering perspective. But it is amazing with these projects. We build it and they do come. The birds, the fish and other aquatic species, the seeds for the plants, even the sediment. Where you lay a template and allow natural processes to move forward, and it's amazing to watch. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was extremely helpful and inspiring information. We are also going to welcome Marilyn and Roger back for our Q&A. So I invite anyone in the audience with questions to throw those into the Q&A box on your screen. Our first question is from John. It was my impression that nature-based solutions are a relatively low-cost solution to sea level rise and climate change, but funding needed to finance these projects show otherwise. Will we be able to finance and implement restoration efforts fast enough to mitigate the effects of sea level rise? Expressing some urgency that we're all feeling, I imagine. Who would like to start off with that?
Yeah, I can touch on that. There is urgency. I mean, we need to get as much vegetated tidal marsh restored by 2030 as we can. That's the scientific recommendation. Right now, we are actually in a good place in terms of funding. So I don't know that funding for restoration is the limiting factor. I think it's a part of it. There's never enough money to do all the stuff you want to do. But there's also challenges with sediment. There's challenges with the permitting of projects. That's not the speediest thing. There's challenges with just coordinating with landowners, infrastructure around the bay. I mean, with the South Bay Shoreline project, we've got Union Pacific Railroad, we got the San Jose water treatment plant, we've got PG&E power lines that run through the project. These things all make it extremely challenging. But I think we're in a good place to be moving these projects forward.
I might say, from my perspective, local, on the ground, it seems to be easier to get funding for planning. The hundreds of thousands, the millions. It's great to know that that's there, but that seems to be a little harder to somewhat to come by. But hopefully that's with more AA's or an expanded AA, that will be different. But I want to really just echo everything Amy said. I mean, the permitting. A lot of our challenges are the infrastructure that's there. A lot of people put pipes and power lines in what was diked marsh, and now we're faced with these as existing. So I think the biggest obstacles are not really the technical, although we still have things to work out. It's CEQA. CEQA makes it hard to do things, and governance. And then I would say funding to some degree, but there's going to have to be some changes to do things on a big scale. It's hard to do things on a big scale in San Francisco Bay.
I guess I just might add that there's such a range of project scales and sizes. And so even small projects can have really high value in terms of being a seed to then raise awareness in the community or demonstrate concepts. So we're showing some huge examples with South Bay salt ponds, and we're showing some smaller examples. And there's a huge diversity of project budgets and methods that could be looked at.
Thank you all. I'd like to get at a question that has come in a couple different phrasings around hardened structures, and for example, around airports that want to build up hard structures around themselves and don't necessarily want to attract a lot of birds to the airports. What can be done to encourage nature-based adaptation in areas like that, then that will also not have the negative effects on the surrounding communities? As we know, what one person does affects their neighbor and all the way around the bay.
Yeah, Marilyn might have lots of good ideas on this. I mean, like with the San Francisco seawall project, for example, there's some interesting things they can incorporate. And I know Seattle has done some interesting things with their hardscape. With airports, it's very challenging. Bear Island is an example of a restoration project next to a small airport, the Santa Clara airport. And they designed the project to create a runway kind of safety area where they built up the land so that it would not attract the large birds. I mean, the geese, the gulls, those are the more problematic birds with airplanes, as you can imagine. The smaller shorebirds are not quite as much of a problem. But yeah, up and down the coast and in the Bay Area, we've got, it's not just SFO and Oakland, there's lots of little airports, and bird airstrike hazards, or BASH, is of concern. And Marilyn, I don't know if you want to talk more about like the seawall and that sort of how you can add green elements to those sorts of hardscapes.
Yeah, there are some really great examples of what are called living seawalls. Seattle is a fantastic world-renowned example where they've got everything from light-emitting blocks on the sidewalk, so allowing light to go down into the water to help vegetation to grow. And then there's a lot of modifications even to a vertical flat structure to make the concrete or the face of that structure more complex for critters such as limpets and snails and crabs and seaweeds to attach to, which then provide really good salmon habitat. They do things like, it almost just looks like bookshelves coming out of the wall, which are ledges that then provide shading and hiding areas for the fish and small fish. So there's really simple modifications. Even taking a Dremel and putting a line into concrete is going to create a little microhabitat that provides for somebody. So there's the Global Harbors Project. I'd have to look up that link, but that's a network of ports around the world that are testing out living seawalls. And so I think this is an area that we should really look at more in San Francisco Bay. I know Port of San Francisco is interested in it and is working, I think, on some pilot efforts to see if they might incorporate something like that into the seawall replacement project.
Thank you. We have a question for Roger about whether it's possible to build beaches that are for habitat purposes that can also be used by people.
Oh, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
they go together very well. That's an easy one. All the attributes that make a nice walking beach are very similar to the ones that, I mean, it's exactly the ones that habitat. Now, the people habitat conflicts, that's a different thing. You may not want to bring people and their dogs down to where the birds are for obvious reasons. So that not so much as much of a technical thing as a landscape sort of design issue of where you want to bring people and where you don't. But certainly compared to like the walls or riprap, which is the worst thing, you just break your ankle walking down these riprap slopes. So they go together very well, and can be programmed together very well too.
Great, that's what we love to hear.
Softball.
Yeah. Here's a question that warms my Sierra Club heart. How can activists and the citizenry get information into practice? How could we lobby for pilot and demonstration projects all along the Bay Shore? Any ideas for those citizen activists out there?
I guess I'll jump in. I think there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, lobbying, as a state employee, I can't do it, but the general public can. So contacting your city council member. One of the benefits during the pandemic is how easily you can Zoom into a meeting in other cities, other states. So I think it's made it more accessible for people to connect with their local planning commission, city council, board of supervisors meetings. So that's one way. Obviously, joining groups like Sierra Club or the Nature Conservancy or other nonprofit advocacy groups really helps to lend your voice and money towards initiatives. And there are so many direct ways to get involved in community-based restoration with groups like Save the Bay and others who are leading on the ground efforts. And that can then lead you down a path of really getting engaged with a variety of projects. So those are just a few ideas.
Yeah, I would add that just to echo that, it's very important to show up, because one thing we've noticed in flood control is there's, I don't know, maybe Marin's different, but there's a lot of people, they're probably smart ex-lawyers or something, but they seem to come in at the last minute and sow doubt. I mean, it seems like their mission to stop us from doing things. What happens is the city councils, you know, they've stopped. I mean, we tried to pass some really modest tax measures, like in Novato, like $49 parcel taxes and such, that would have done a lot of restoration in the Novato Baylands. And people come in at the last minute. They're all on platforms like Nextdoor or Facebook or things that we don't really allowed to gauge in. And so if we had, if it would really helpful to have other people that show up and present the other side. And it's very easy to raise doubt. I mean, we get even weird technical questions about rainfall we're using and things that are not technically correct, but there's enough that people get very riled up. And we've seen this process, and I won't go on, but recently Corte Madera had that happen, just a recent adaptation plan. So again, I don't know if Marin's different, but it's very easy for a very small number of people to throw a lot of sand in the gears and stop things. It's harder to make things happen, but it's not that hard to stop things in our experience.
Very appropriate metaphor, the sand and the gears.
And not on the beach where we want it.
Right. We want it on the beach. We had a question it's a little bit of a longer question, so bear with me. One of the Dutch approaches to manage shores is to create habitat buffer zones along the edge of the North Sea. This includes creating dune habitats between human settlements and the sea. Around the bay, varied habitat could be created on existing mudflat and shallow subtidal areas by depositing dredged soils and upland material and raising the bathymetry to elevations that support marsh and other habitat types in combination with mudflat and subtidal areas. Could this approach be applied here?
Well, it's been, I mean, if you go to just Letitia's talk, that went into that in some detail. Yeah, I mean, there's some barriers, of course, a lot of concern over turbidity. I think sometimes too much concern, but chronic turbidity is an impact. So this idea of just putting mud into the water column or near shore has been studied. I'm personally in favor of it, but there's some, a lot of studies required. There's a whole idea we've done in Marin. I think we're the first to do a thin lift dredge project in Novato, where we put dredge material down. Now, it wasn't in an active tidal marsh, we're preparing, but thin lift dredge placement's another one. And Letitia talked about reservoir management, and there's all sorts of ideas. I think there is a recent report by SFEI, one of their dramatic titles, Sediment for Survival, but an idea of reusing, the importance of doing that. And so the answer is yes. I'd like to just add a little coda to that, though. What the Dutch, that's their sand engine, of course, placement. But really what I think we can learn from the Dutch is their governance. If we want to really get to the heart of this thing, they have a much more mission-driven approach to sea level rise. So it's not, we're going to make everybody happy, the dog walkers and we have a very much more, we have to resolve everything. The Dutch, because they had big floods in the 50s, I think, and a lot of people died. So they're of a much more mission driven, because they're basically the country's below sea level. So, it's very hard to use eminent domain, as I think Amy talked about, or Marilyn. And so we're having to do things in a much more difficult way. I'm not saying that's good or bad. That represents democracy in a way, but Dutch, I think, have a much more, we're going to do it. We're going to take the land and we're going to do it. We're going to compensate you, but we're not going to, not do it. It's my opinion, and I'm no expert on this, but it's my impression.
Yeah, I think the Dutch approach, it's the federal government, and it's not the same as the Bay Area. Yeah. Democracy is messy, and we've got, lots of local governments, state government, federal government, all playing a role in this. I think one thing I would say is sediment is the most critical issue for us in San Francisco Bay. And, you know, Letitia spoke to this really well. There's not enough of it. We need to make sure every bit of sediment is being well managed. So our dredge sediment from our ports and navigation channels, making sure that's not being wasted. The sediment from our watersheds, connecting that up with San Francisco Bay. And yeah, within our projects, our tidal marsh and subtidal projects, really thinking about how we capture sediment and use it to protect our shorelines. And it's not easy. There are not easy answers, and it's the one of the largest parts of the price tag for our restoration work around San Francisco Bay. Yeah, I'll end it there.
Well, thank you, Amy. And I want to thank all of you, our brilliant speakers today, for sharing your knowledge and this important information with us this morning. This brings us to the end of today's webinar, but I would like to remind everyone watching that next Thursday at 9 a.m. we have the third in this series. And next week, our speakers will be going into greater depth with some case studies and also some funding opportunities for nature-based adaptation. I want to thank also the tireless Sierra Club volunteers and staff who have put so much time and brain power into making this program possible. It's a team effort, and you are so much appreciated. As you click out, you will see a short survey about today's presentation, and we would be much obliged if you would just take a minute to fill it out. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning, and we hope to see you again next week on Zoom.